You teach a course on happiness at Yale, and the first thing that comes to mind is it actually possible to teach happiness? Because it sounds to many, and I sort of put myself in that camp a few years ago, it sounds to many like this is something you are or you're not. It's not a skill set, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that so many people think. In fact, so many people think this that people had to do research on this, right? Is it just the case that some people are just genetically predetermined as
Hmm.
happy or unhappy? And it turns out that if you ask whether happiness is heritable, in other words, there's some part of your genes that's coding for it, the answer seems to be both yes and no. Yes, there is some part of happiness that's heritable, so that people, if you came from parents who were super happy and grandparents who were super happy, you're more likely to be a little bit happier, but it's not as heritable as most traits. It's probably less heritable than something like your height or even your weight. And we know that that has obviously a huge influence based on
Hmm.
what you're eating and stuff. And that's really good news, right? Because it would suck if happiness was just built in and you were kind of screwed.
Well,
And
yeah.
so, and so that's kind of one piece of good news. The other piece of good news is that it doesn't seem like happiness also comes from our circumstances, right? Because, maybe you might have some flexibility in terms of your genes, but you're born into poverty or you're born into some yucky circumstance, right? And so the good news is that happiness doesn't seem to be just in our genes and it doesn't seem to be just in our circumstances. There seems to be a lot of wiggle room based on our behavior and our mindset. And that's great because it means we can teach it, we can get better. It's good news.
Right. It means if we don't have it, then we can change it, which is great. Especially, look, my heritage is Jewish. Nobody in my family's happy. Even even the happy ones aren't happy, right? Okay, like my grandma and grandpa, they if you're happy, they're like, hey, don't do that. You got to knock it off. Like that's part of our culture. Don't get too happy because something's gonna go wrong. And it's a joke, but it's also kind of not a joke because when your whole family's kind of like, hey, don't celebrate now, it's like, well, what? Like you learn. I feel like, especially in a lot of these old families, not just Jewish people, but like old sort of old world families, they kind of I don't know what your heritage is. I can sort of assume, but there's something with older folks that come from Europe and other places like that. They're kind of like, hey, calm down. That's like the whole vibe when you're a kid is like, calm down. You never know what's going to happen. And Asians have the same thing. There are Chinese proverbs that are like, a man fell off his horse and broke his leg. And they said, oh, it's so terrible. Your son broke his leg. And it's like, not yet. And then the army comes by and is recruiting. So it's like all these Chinese proverbs are like, don't get happy about anything, but also don't get sad about anything. Just stay as vanilla as you can.
Yeah, well, I
Um,
grew up I grew up Catholic and they build in
okay.
the
Well,
guilt,
y'all not.
oh, you're
Yeah.
feeling happy? Like now it's the guilt's
You're
kicking in.
going to hell. You're
Yeah.
happy? Well, you're screwed now. Yeah. It's from the devil. You also think like, look, achievements, very apropos the Olympics that are just wrapping up here. The achievements that people has in life can make you happy, right? I remember when I was young, I was like, if I just had a girlfriend, I'd be so much happier. And if, when you're broke and you're unemployed, you're like, I just need this job. I need this raise. I need this promotion. And the Olympics, right? The gold medal, you see these, and you mentioned this in your work, we'll get to it in a bit, but like the silver medalists, they're just crushed. Their life is over, even though they're the second best in the entire world by 1/10 of a second in whatever they've been training for their whole lives for. And they're just like, my life is done. I hate it. I hate it. This is the achievement thing is weird because it's like you should get happy from that, and then you don't. You win the lottery and you're depressed.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up, right? Because this is the weird thing about happiness. It's not that we don't like have any theories about how it works. We definitely think there are things that could happen in our lives that would make us really happy, right? If think if I won the lottery today and I, had $800 billion, definitely be happier. Maybe if I was a gold medalist, definitely be happier, right? But it turns out if you go out and you study people who have had those good things happen, right? We can bring lottery winners into the laboratory and test their happiness. We could study different Olympic medalists. What you find is that the happiness that you predict you're going to get is never as high as you think. But also, more importantly, you're never as happy for as long as you think. This is a big misconception. We think happiness is like happily ever after. I'll get a girlfriend, I'll be happy forever,
Hmm.
or I'll win the lottery and be happy forever. And most of the time, people just go back to their baseline after circumstantial changes. So you win the lottery, the Tuesday you win the lottery is a friggin' awesome day, right? When you win
Yeah.
$150 million on that Tuesday, that day is an awesome day. But it turns out, the research has studied this, if you go back 6 months later to people who've had that happen, a year later, their happiness is basically back at baseline. Like it goes back really much more quickly than you think. That's kind of the bad news, but the good news is that the same thing happens for bad stuff. You might predict, find out I had, lung cancer. Like that would suck. If I lost my job, that would suck. But if I lost my relationship, but that would suck. But it turns out when you study people for whom those bad events really happen, what you find is that they too go back to baseline. It might suck, that afternoon you find out you have lung cancer. That's a crappy afternoon. But then, 6 months later, 1 year later, you're often happier than you think. And sometimes the crazy thing with the bad events is that sometimes those bad events really convince you what's meaningful in your life, what your purpose is. I mean, I think some of us are going through this in the pandemic where we're thinking, I've learned something about what I want out of life. I've learned something about, how much I really want to be spending time commuting or things like that. People are making these changes that ultimately will make their life better, but those changes came out of something that we all would describe as traumatic, that we wouldn't wish on this society.
I got to be honest. I've my lessons from the pandemic are probably pretty pedestrian. Like I'm never taking travel for granted again. But also, I am going to enjoy the shit out of the next trip that I'm able to take. That is fact. And
Totally.
and and I think every time I'm on my way to the airport for the next 20 years, I'm going to be like, remember when we just couldn't do this? We weren't going. I'll be stuck at a gate or on the tarmac, and they'll be like, you can't pee for 10 hours, and I'll be like, I'm going on a trip, right? I'm going to be so ready for that. Of course, I'll also, hedonically adapt and go back to baseline and be like, this food sucks on the airplane. But still, I'd like to think that I'm just going to be so ready to get the hell out of my kitchen after all this that I'm never going to forget it.
And I think that this is, I feel the same way about like concerts and movies, right? The next movie I can go to without
Mm.
worrying that I'm like breathing in some sort of horrible thing that's going to kill me, like that's going to feel amazing. And I think, this is the power of something that really can change our happiness, not the circumstance. It's not that you're getting this new event where you're going on a trip where you're kind of being in a movie theater. What's changing is the fact that you're experiencing a different mindset about that event. You are grateful for it in a way that you never ever were before. And I think that that's another strange thing the pandemic's going to do. Definitely, at least the first time we get these things, we're going to experience so much more joy than we ever had before. Even during the process of this pandemic, as you get like to a point where things are feeling safer, people are vaccinated and things like the first time I gave my mom a hug, I could see her in person and give her a hug. Like that felt amazing. The first time I went back to my coffee shop that I love so much and just like walked in, I mean, I'd gotten there thousands of times and taken it for granted, but that first time back felt so good. And there are techniques we can use to do that more often, right? One technique that's actually an ancient technique, the ancient Stoics used to suggest that we do
They're
this.
trending right now,
Yeah, they're
funnily
big.
enough.
They're big. Yeah, and I mean, and they're smart, right? They suggested this process called negative visualization. I mean, this is what the Stoics thought you should do. When you wake up in the morning, you should think, my partner is going to leave me. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to like break, some part of my body that I really need. I'm going to get, isolated and kicked out of all of society. And then you open your eyes and you're like, wait, that hasn't happened. Like, that's amazing, right? And so the idea of negative visualization is like, maybe we don't need to go through an 18-month global pandemic to like appreciate going to the airport and going to the movies. You can kind of imagine it and simulate it and just remember what you really miss in life, just kind of remember what you should be grateful for, but sometimes aren't as much as you should be.
Now we know where the Catholics and the Jews and all the other folks got their visualization techniques, right? Their self-talk from the Stoics. Let's talk about the silver medalists, right? I kind of touched on this before. I thought this was really interesting that silver medalists are extremely unhappy, on the whole, extremely unhappy that they didn't get gold, but bronze medalists seem to be super happy. And that silver medalists, years later, they even die younger, which is so sad somehow, right? Like usually you're not totally wrecked by getting a silver. You're behind by like a fraction of it. You've slipped slightly when you were diving into the pool, and that was the end of it. You never had a chance, but you've beaten that time a million other times during practice, right? You're basically number one. You just weren't that one particular day. And your life the entire trajectory of your life is totally screwed from then
Yeah, and
on
surprisingly,
average.
that is what the science shows. It's really depressing when you really
Yeah.
look at silver medalists. And again, you think of what got them there, right? They had this moment where like they're getting into the Olympics, they're going to represent their country. Maybe they're part of a big team, and now you're going to actually play at the Olympics. You beat like pretty much everybody, every other country, except one, and you can't enjoy it. And the reason behind that is that we don't tend to think of the good things in our lives objectively. Like you might think, I want to be, objectively at a certain wealth or objectively at a certain performance level, but our brain just can't hold on to things objectively. Our brain has to use what's called a reference point. Like, who can I compare myself to and see how I'm doing with my income, with my looks, or in this case, with my performance in the Olympics? And, if you're a silver medalist, there's a very salient other reference point out there, which is the gold. Like you almost got there if it weren't for that one other person.
Hmm.
And rather than feel at the top, when you compare yourself against the one person who's better than you feel like crap. You feel awful. And that's why when you look at the scientists have done these things where they look at videotapes of silver medalists on the stand and kind of analyze facial expressions. And it's not just so much that they're not happy, they're actually showing emotions like contempt, disgust, deep sadness, anger, right? They're miserable. But what's shocking and what it shows you the power of these reference points is that you might predict, given how sad the silver medalists are, if you look at the bronze medalists, that they'd be even more miserable. After all, they were many seconds from winning, right?
Yeah, like, bro, you weren't even close,
Yeah,
right?
right.
You weren't even close.
But it turns out not so. In fact, in some of the analyses, the bronze medalists look even happier than the gold medalists. And the reason there again gets back to reference points. Like, what's the bronze medalist reference points? It's not silver or gold. Gold was
Yeah,
really
it's
far.
not. It's forgotten into obscurity forever. Slash, like
Yeah,
never
it's
even.
like, like 2 seconds away, and I'd be going home empty handed. My whole life was moving up to this moment, and I could have walked away with literally nothing. So they are stoked, right? Their reference point, is telling them that everything's great. And this is such a powerful message, I think, for all of us, right? Because, if you're comparing yourself, money wise against Jeff Bezos, if you're comparing yourself looks wise against like Beyonce, if you're picking this reference point that's going to make you feel like crap, you're going to feel like crap. But there are also lots of other reference points out there that you could be using to feel good about yourself. And it's powerful because there's all these cases in which we're objectively doing great. So many people listening to this podcast are objectively probably pretty healthy, objectively doing okay, roof over your head and these kinds of things. But we don't tend to compare ourselves to people who are doing worse than that. We don't tend to recognize it. And that means we're missing out on the happiness that our actual objective circumstances could be giving us, but are not.
I want to get back to comparisons in a second. Although I will say I do have a better jawline than Beyonce. But what does happy even mean? Maybe we should back up for a second because I think people are going, cool scientist who studies this thing that you can't even measure. Nice try. You're just trying to make me feel better. So how do we? I mean, obviously you've gone through painstaking measures to figure out how to measure this, or the whole thing is for naught, right?
Yeah. And I wish honestly, I mean, this is like a real problem with the field,
Hmm.
right? Like I wish we had some sort of thermometer for happiness and I could stick it in your mouth and be like, boop, 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 like you're
Hmm.
98.6 on happiness, right? The honest answer is we don't, but we do have great techniques that researchers have come up with that seem to be pretty valid. In other words, they're like measuring something that we think is real, and they also seem to be pretty reliable. In other words, if I give you different ones of these, I get kind of the same answer, right? If you put your thermometer in your mouth and every time you measured it was a different temperature, you'd be like, this thing's broken. The happiness instruments we have, these self-report instruments, like they actually give us the same answer, which is really telling. But what this really important experimental technique is just to ask people if they're happy, is to ask people two things about happiness. One is kind of, are you happy with your life? All things considered, are you satisfied with your life? That's kind of one of the sort of questions people use. The other thing they ask you is if you're happy in your life. And that's kind of the emotions you experience. I literally give you a list of emotions: happy, sad, angry, sad, whatever. And then you say, on a scale of 1 to 7, how often do you experience those? And that can feel like a silly BuzzFeed quiz, when I
Yeah, totally.
explain
Like
it.
a cosmopolitan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
But, there's tons of research showing that, your answer to that will predict something like if I measure your stress hormones, or if I do like a detailed like text analysis of your journals or your tweets or something like that, or if I do like super, super detailed interviews with your family members and ask them how you're doing. Like these things that sound like silly quizzes are actually real scientific instruments. And when we use them, we see what kind of moves the needle on those measures.
So happy people tend to experience more positive emotions, obviously, right? And do we know what these emotions are? Is it like a specific subset, or is it just overarching happiness?
Yeah, well, I think, I think that those two parts of happiness, like this idea of being happy in your life and with your
Hmm.
life, it's important to realize they're different constructs, right? You can be high on one and low on the other, right? My academic dean, who like lives with me here in the college where I live at Yale, she and her wife just had a new baby, and that she's really happy, with her life. Oh my gosh, she's a new mom. This is amazing. But in her life, it sucks, right? Like, the kids screaming, there's poopy diapers, and like, it's just not good, right? So you can get that dissociation. I think you also, go on Instagram and see the other dissociation, right? People who are, really happy in their life, they're on planes and have all the luxuries, but with their life they're feeling really empty. And so what scientists are trying to do is maximize both. And the way you get to both is to kind of focus on what you were mentioning, which is these positive emotions. Just things like laughter, joy, delight, these kinds of things, like even things like kind of contentment, right? These kind of more chiller emotions, those are all good. But I think another mistake we make about happiness is that we assume that we have to have those emotions in the absence of the negative stuff. It's not boost
Mm.
up the positive, it's like get rid of the anger and the sadness and the frustration. And what the research really shows is that that's not necessarily a path to happiness. A full happy life where you're sort of satisfied with your life actually comes with some negative emotions. They can teach us things. Many of our negative emotions are really problem solving emotions. Like when you get sad, it's not just something your body does to like torture you. It's often telling you you're like missing something in your life, like you're maybe missing a person in your life, or you're not happy with your job and maybe you should do something to change it. And so, we think of these emotions as just we're stuck with them and they're torturing
Annoying.
us. But
Yeah.
they're almost like a little notification on our phones. It's telling us like, hey, something's amiss. Like you got to do something about this.
That makes sense. I love the distinction between being happy in your life and being happy with your life. Like right now, I'm happy with my life. My wife's pregnant. I've got a 2 year old. Everyone's healthy. They're super cute, right? But in my day to day, I get up. I've slept okay because there's a baby crying. Not great. I drink and eat a lot of the same stuff. I'm in the same kitchen. I'm in my studio. I can't go on a trip to Greece or anything like I've been overdue for 5 freaking years. You know what I mean? Like there's little things that and it sounds so trite, so I don't even complain about it, especially not in public on this show usually, because people are like, "So I lost my job and my grandma died of COVID, and you're whining about not being able to take a cruise to Greece? Like, go f yourself, Jordan." Right? So I don't say that stuff publicly, but I know a lot of people are feeling it. They're sick of looking at their refrigerator and their laptop. That and as trite as it is, it's still a problem for a lot of people. But like with my path, look, set for retirement, business going great, family going great, not a lot to complain about, but a hell of a lack of variety, in my day to day. And I won't say I'm unhappy, but I'm certainly not like waking up bright eyed and bushy tailed and ready to attack the day. I need a freaking vacation.
Yeah. And I think, one thing, and I think you're not alone, right? We can quibble and try to compare our levels of misery during COVID, but this hasn't been a unicorn ride for pretty much most people, right? Even, if your circumstances are ostensibly good, often your routine has changed, like your ability to go out and do things you enjoyed before has changed. Your social connections probably decreased because you haven't seen people
Oh
you care
yeah.
about in so long. And so these are real hits to our happiness. It's not to say that things would be worse, obviously, if you lost a family member to COVID, definitely. But, that sucks. And I think one thing we need to do in the pandemic, and that we often haven't allowed ourselves to do, is to like feel the fact that it sucks, right? Take some time to give yourself some self compassion of like, I just lived through like a worldwide global pandemic. Maybe not even lived through because we're still kind of getting through
Yeah,
it,
where
at the
I was
time
gonna
you and I
say,
are
where are you
talking.
in the timeline? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and that like that's crappy, and giving yourself a little bit of grace about it being crappy, recognizing you're human and that those things are gonna feel nasty, not running away from the nasty feelings, kind of sitting with them and sort of allowing them to be there. Like those are processes that can help you get through it, get through the negative emotions. And then there are other strategies you can use to say, all right, I can't go on my vacation right now, but how can I build, a little bit more fun into my life given the health constraints that the pandemic poses? And they're kind of active things you can do to feel better too.
A lot of people really are down in the dumps or clinically depressed, and not just because of the pandemic, just generally, right? So they think that being happy is actually really far away from them. And from the emails that I get in my Feedback Friday inbox, which is like an advice show that we do, a lot of people, they assume, so let's say you stub your toe, you're unhappy in the moment kind of, or like you've been having a bad week, or you didn't get a promotion you wanted. You're sort of like a quick turn to happiness, right? In most people's mind. But if you're clinically depressed and you can't get out of bed, you view that turn to happiness, that is miles through this unknown maze of uncharted waters for you. But it seems like the research shows that's not necessarily true, right? It seems like you're not really any further away from making yourself happy, or getting the skills to become happy, or putting yourself in a happy place, along with treatment, of course, if you're in psychological distress. It just sort of seems like you're at the bottom of a well when really you're maybe about as far away as anyone else. Is that true to your
Yeah.
observation?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things with that. One is it is the case that some people are in acute mental health distress, right? And we
For
need
sure.
to
For sure.
recognize
Yeah.
that, right? Often, people will, ask me, about these kinds of things who are, feeling acutely suicidal or in the middle of a panic attack, right? And the analogy I often use, if you go to your doctor and you say, "Hey, doctor, I have high blood pressure. What should I do?" The doctor might say, "Hey, hop on the treadmill, eat healthy." If you walk into your doctor's office, clutching your chest and are like, "I'm in acute cardiac arrest," your doctor's not gonna be like, "Hey, hop on the treadmill." They're gonna
Right.
bring out
Yeah.
the big guns and whatever. And so I think for some levels of mental health distress, the sort of treatment requires the big guns. But and for those people who are suffering, we could talk about what those treatments look like. You really do need a sort of professional treatment. But for many of us, what we should be focused on is like, the high blood pressure part. So we don't get to that acute level, right? What is the preventative medicine to kind of protect our mental health? And, many of us like think in terms of, preventative medicine for our physical health. We're trying to eat healthier, get more
Right.
exercise and things.
Sure.
I think we have to be just as proactive about our mental health, especially in such a nasty time like the time we're living in right now, where we're not naturally getting the doses of social connection and the kinds of good feelings that we would normally be getting through vacations and the like. You kind of have to put more work in, just like you put work into your diet and exercise, you got to put work into your mental health too.
Let's go back to lottery winners, because this is so interesting, I think, for a lot of people. None of us probably who are listening have won. Well, I'm sure, actually, I take it back. I think somebody who's listening to this has for sure won the lottery and maybe experienced this, but the bulk of us haven't. Lottery winners are often unhappy because, as you phrase it in the Happiness Lab, the episode about the lottery, people only think about what they have gained or what they will gain, not what they will lose. And that was pretty insightful, because, of course, when I'm thinking about the lottery, and I consider myself like I try to mitigate bias. I would never think, what am I going to lose if I end up with $160 million, right? That would never even enter my mind at all. And if I did, it would be like, oh, I'm going to lose all of the annoying bills that I have to worry about
Car
every month, right?
payments out the
Yeah,
door.
car
Yeah,
pay.
yeah.
I'm going to lose some of my neighbors that I really don't like that much when I move to Bel Air, right? Like, come on. So, but it turns out you lose a lot more than that, and it's unforeseen. And that seems like one of the major reasons these people end up unhappy. I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to real lottery winners, what happened? The first thing you lose often is like the normalcy of your social connection, right? The easiest way to get a lot of weirdos to come out of the woodwork, from your Facebook friends you don't want to talk to, is to win the lottery. People show up and say, "Hey, I have this legitimate problem. How are you going to help me?" Right? And you're like, "Crap! Like, who do I decide to help? How do I decide to help? Am I enabling people? Like, how do I make those decisions? How do I hurt people by sometimes saying no?" Right? You forget you can't hang out with your buds anymore in the same way. Like that, like, I don't know, your favorite, bar, coffee shop you used to go to with your friends, you split the tab, with the chicken wings or whatever. Like, can't, they're looking at you, you're looking at them, right?
They're
You're
like,
not
right.
gonna
They're making $400. They're like, you made $160 million. I am not paying for these fucking chicken wings, man.
right.
These are
And
your
you're
chicken wings.
and you'll have more opportunities come up, right? You'd probably want to move to a better place, right, than the
Hmm.
crappy apartment you live in. But now you're far from your friends, and they come over and they feel like crap because their car, their furniture, their whatever is not as good as yours, and so you kind of lose this connection. And then you also have these kind of moments where you lose time, right? Now you got to hire a financial analyst and make sure you're investing it right, and so on. I mean, these things don't sound like big losses, but if you look empirically, you find that a lot of lottery winners, if you come back a year later, are miserable or at least just as happy as they were before, right? It doesn't make them happier. But you also find a lot of them that have say committed suicide, right? Because things go so bad. Your marriage breaks down because it's had so many changes. Your kids are upset, and so we sometimes it's gonna like know what you want to wish for or be careful what you wish for. I think the lottery is one of those, but the same is true for these awful events. In my podcast, I interview people who've been in accidents and you've been burned over 3/4 of their body, or
That guy was amazing. I got to get that guy's email address at the end of the show. He was really something.
yeah, but I mean, and one of the studies is on people who've been in an accident and become paraplegic. So if you're listening to this podcast in your car, imagine, something bad happens, you're in a horrible accident, and now you lose your legs, right? What does that do to your happiness? Again, in the moment, it's going to suck. Like if this happened today, this again be a pretty crappy afternoon. But when you go back to people for whom that's really happened, 6 months later, 1 year later, they say their happiness is as good as it was before. And sometimes they say it's the best thing that ever happened to them. The J.R. Martinez, the guy you're mentioning in my podcast, who I interviewed, who was, in war, and like he like had a Humvee blow up. So he's burned over 3/4 of his body. He lost his military career. He lost his looks. He was kind of this good looking guy before, just his whole life was changed. And I said, would you change anything? Would you go back and make that Humvee not blow up? And he was like, no, I'm blessed. Like, this has given me so many gifts that I wouldn't have imagined. And like, you don't think, getting in a horrible car accident, becoming paraplegic, terminal cancer diagnosis, all these things, you don't think those are going to change your life for the positive. But the people who've actually experienced those things in a lot of cases will say, yeah, more good than bad came of that, which is shocking.
People's prediction of what's going to happen when they win the lottery or when a bad thing happens is off. So it happens both when we predict positive outcomes and when we predict negative outcomes. From the sound of it, we think it's going to be great or we think it's going to be horrible, and it turns out to not necessarily really be either of those things. But the disparity between what we think and hope will happen in the case of a good thing and what actually happens, is that what's triggering the sadness and desperation? Like if I win the gold medal and I'm still me, but now there's more expectations, but I'm still like, I'm not rich and famous anymore because it's been a year since the Olympics and nobody remembers my awesome ski jump except for me, right, and my coach. That seems like what it would trigger it. That seems like, you really are placing too much pressure on this random singular event, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's a bias that like researchers call focalism, right? Like when you're thinking about winning the lottery, you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna be rich. You're not thinking, I'm still gonna have to like, pay my taxes. I'm still gonna, my knee's still gonna hurt. Like, that like there's just stuff in life that's kind of a pain in the butt. Same thing if you're paraplegic, there's still gonna be laughter, spring's still gonna come around, pizza's still gonna taste awesome, right? Like you just forget that there's still gonna be good things. So focalism means you focus on this one thing that you think is gonna matter so much, but really the rest of life is going to be the rest of life. In my podcast, I do one episode on my Yale students. Yale is one of these places that, students would, give their arm to be able to get into, like this is a school that accepts so few people. My students work so hard to get here. And I show these little videos because now students these days post videos of themselves, doing embarrassing or sad moments. So students will videotape, when they click on the link, did I get into Yale or not? And then they'll post that on YouTube. And sometimes it's sad and sometimes it's really happy. And so I show these videos of these students who like find out they get into Yale and completely freak out and are screaming. And my students will say, yeah, I freaked out and that was an awesome moment. But about like 10 minutes later, I was like, and now what? Like, I just, I was lonely. I lost all the sleep. I got into this place and like, now I just have to be awesome there and get into medical, So I think we place our accomplishments, as this like, this is going to happen and I'm happily ever after, I'll just be happy forever. But that's just not how life works. Dan Gilbert, the psychologist who I interview, is fond of saying happily ever after only works if you have 10 minutes to live.
Yeah,
like
which is a little dark, Dan. A little
yeah.
dark. Yeah. What about impact bias? This is another sort of, along with hedonic adaptation, where we get used to stuff and return to baseline. Impact bias is another sort of useful term. Tell me about that.
Yeah, impact bias is kind of the idea that it's not so much that we're bad at predicting what we're going to feel when good and bad events happen. I predict lottery is going to probably feel good for a little while, becoming paraplegic is probably going to feel bad for a little while, right? We kind of get the valence right, but we get the amount of that valence and the duration of that valence wrong. So what do I mean? Let's say, you win the lottery. You predict positive valence, it's going to feel positive, but it doesn't feel as good as you predict. You find out you get into Yale. You predict positive valence, but it's not as good as you thought. and the impact doesn't last for as long as you thought. You thought it was going to be for the rest of my life. It was for, a couple weeks when you get to brag to people you're going to Ivy League school, right? And then it kind of got old. So impact bias is this idea that we think the impact is going to be huge and last for a really long duration. And it's never as huge or for as long as we think. And again,
Mm.
that sucks in the positive direction. It means the lotteries and the getting into Ivy League schools of life don't feel great. But the same is true in the negative direction. It means the breakups and the losing the jobs and the getting awful medical diagnoses. Those aren't going to hurt for as long as we think either, or as bad as we think.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. It takes some life experience to understand this, though, right? Because I remember going through things when I was like 18, 19 and being like, no, you don't understand. I'm never going to get over this. And now I'm like, what was that thing again? And, even a few years later when someone like stole from me and it was like a close friend, I was so pissed. I helped him move. I gave him money and then he like ended up stealing from me. And I'm like, I'm never going to be not mad at this person. And what's funny is like a few years later, he texted me and he was like, hey man, I want to catch up with you. And I thought I would be so livid, but instead I was like, I don't even care about this guy. Like I didn't even bother blocking his number. I was just like, what a loser. Next. Like I probably like went back to eating my lunch. It just didn't even register. And a lot of the things that have made me the most angry or upset in my whole life, even just a few short years later, I'm like, well, that wasn't such a big deal. Or that actually worked out really well for me, but the older I get, the easier it is for me to get there because my timeline is stretched out. Whereas if I'm 12 and my mom won't buy me Nintendo, I'm like, my life is definitely going to take a different turn now that I don't have Nintendo, right? And now it's like I can lose a job and a business and a relationship, and I'm like, I will probably be fine in a couple of years.
Yeah, I think we get better at it, and in part because we have experience with it, right? You break up with someone, you're like, I'm never gonna feel good again, and then
Right.
2 years later, you're fine, and then the next breakup happens. You can kind of look back to the other breakup and think, well, I
Hmm.
guess with Joe, it got better faster than I thought. And so you get little hints, but for many of us. Even that insight doesn't generalize really fully. Like, what it really means is like you're going to be the worst possible thing that you could imagine could happen to you. And it's actually not going to be as bad as you think. Many of us don't make that strong a generalization. And there's real evidence that even people who have the same thing happen again don't generalize as much as they think. One of my favorite funny studies of this, because you have to find these moments where bad things happen to people that are not so bad that you can kind of experimentally study. And one study looked at people who failed their driver's test multiple times. So people's going in for the driver's test, and you're going to get license. Like, how happy will you feel if you get it? How sad will you feel if you don't get it? And people predict, and then go through the stop sign, you fail, and then you say, well, how bad was it? People say, it wasn't as bad as I think. But those people who failed are probably going to go back a second time. So researchers will be like, okay, second time, how bad are you going to predict you're going to feel if you fail? And they update a little bit. They're like, yeah, it won't be, but they're still not realizing how much resilience they have. And so what you find is that even people who failed several times in a row, they update a tad, but not that much. Like we keep forgetting how resilient we are. We're what's called, this is something that the psychologist Dan Gilbert calls immune neglect. He says, we kind of have like this psychological immune system, right? When bad things happen, we have all these things that come in and fight it and say, well, she wasn't good for you anyway, or screw it, I never really wanted a license, or, paraplegic, I didn't need my legs. Like we have these mechanisms to come in and convince ourselves it's not that bad. But we have immune neglect. We don't realize the psychological immune system is as powerful as it is. We neglect that we're going to do all this stuff to feel better. And that means that we're not taking risks that we could take. You might be scared, like, well, if I break up this person, I'll never get over the pain of it. Like, nah, you'll just be fine. Maybe you want to leave that job or take a risk in your business, and you think, oh, it's, if the bad outcome happens, I just won't be able to handle it. And the science suggests you will. You just don't realize it.
It's a little bit of a myth, and we touched on this before, that one change ahead is going to make us happier. We know that that's not true. What about when your circumstances are truly horrible? I assume there's exceptions to this. Like if I'm born in Yemen to a mother who's a teenager and we're hiding in an abandoned building because of a war, that's a bad environment, right? A change to a secure environment's going to make us all happier, I assume.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I'm glad you brought that up. We often say, oh, for example, like money doesn't matter as much as you think for happiness. But
Hmm.
again, like if you can't put food on your table, if you can't put a roof over your head, if you're living in dire poverty, yeah, getting some more money is going to give you the creature comforts you need for happiness. And so it's not that circumstances matter zero. If you're in truly traumatic circumstances, yeah, changing your circumstances is probably going to help a lot. But for most of us, we're not in those dire circumstances, right?
Right.
Like not being able to get the newest PlayStation is not like, like the Yemeni, like, trauma you're talking about, right? And so I think we want to be careful. It's not that circumstances don't matter at all. It's that most of the, 99.99% of the people listening to this podcast right now are probably in circumstances where changing them drastically isn't going to matter for their happiness as much as they think.
So I assume some of these other I don't want to. As far as the dramatically poor environments are concerned, okay, the Yemen thing, obvious example. What about like an abusive relationship or a bad job, which candidly can have a lot of commonalities with an abusive relationship in many ways, depending on the job. Like if you're bullied at work or you have a terrible boss. Um, those, I assume, like where does it sort of stop? You mentioned, yes, the newest PlayStation, but I assume there's common examples of people in bad environments where you're like, okay, this is a common environment that could be changed. Because like you said, 99.9% of the people plus listening are not in a Yemeni war zone, but a lot of people are in crappy relationships and crappy jobs.
Yeah, and I think, one thing you need to think about is I think this is where the psychological immune system can be so powerful. We often have a sense of like, I'm just kind of not happy with it versus there's something really wrong. I'm getting physically hurt in this situation. I'm getting actually psychologically abused, right? All of those cases are ones in which changing things will be good. But if you're kind of just like run of the mill, not excited about stuff, then there's lots of mechanisms you can use to kind of get a little bit better. One of my favorite ones in the context of jobs is what researcher Amy Resniski at Yale calls job crafting. She does these great studies where she interviews people in a job that you might not think of as like the most glamorous career path. So she interviews hospital janitorial workers, right? I mean, these
Oh,
are people who
God.
are like
Ugh.
cleaning up vomit, taking people's linens away and stuff, like not great. But what she finds is there's a certain subset of them. She asks, do you like your job? Do you feel like your job is a calling? They'll say, yeah, my job is a calling. I could not imagine doing anything better in my life. I love it so much. And you're like, what is going on with these people? And what you find is that they're finding ways, even though their job is to be a janitor, to infuse in what they find valuable. So one janitor, for example, talked about how he uses his job to try to make sick patients feel better. So his job was like cleaning up the vomit in a like chemotherapy ward, like not great. But he'd
Hmm.
come in and he'd like, just like laugh around and joke around with the person. He'd be like, you know what, don't feel bad about vomiting on the floor because that's why I have this job. Like I got a car payment to make. Like you keep vomiting on this floor, you're giving, and then the person laughs and he laughs. He's like, that's my job isn't, to clean up the sick. Like my job is to like make this person laugh. That's what I get value from. And so job crafting, then you could have all kinds of different values. His was really about doing something nice for people, being social. It could be a love of learning. It could be doing something brave. It could be taking risks. It could be exercising your creativity. She claims that like if janitorial staff can infuse this stuff into their daily life, most of us in most professions could do that. She's another example of a woman who, a janitorial staff member who worked on a coma ward. And the staff member every day would slightly move the like paintings and the pots in the room. And she thought like maybe I think it might be helping these coma patients a little bit just to like notice some changes. Like I don't know if medically that's a thing, but she like had this sense that she was helping, right? She had this sense that she was doing something that she'd come up with that was creative, that was sort of helping her. And so Amy thinks that, these are there are ways we can job craft in every profession. Now, does that mean, I don't know if you like have some office job that you're like, my job crafting is I'm just going to play guitar every day at my, like you have to do what's in your job description,
Hmm.
but there are lots of ways to infuse some creative crafting into that. And she has lots of
Yeah.
suggestions on her website, a little survey to sort of brainstorm how you can do this.
I mean, I know tax planners and accountants that they sort of play a game. How much money can I save my client on taxes? Because they know if they go, I saved you $89,000 on taxes, the person's going to be like, dang. And then if they beat that next year, it's like, look, they made more money last year, which is why they were able to save more on tax. But that's beside the point. The point is, you were going to give this to Uncle Sam to spend on toilet seats, and now you can spend it on your retirement or your kid's college education or whatever it is. So that kind of thing is I guess probably how he does that. He didn't use that term, obviously, but it totally makes sense that every job has that somewhere,
Yeah,
even if
and I
it's not obvious.
and you just have to kind of get creative with it. I mean, one thing, we often don't really think a lot about our values, what really gives us joy. Is it social connection? Is it doing something creative? Is it learning something? Is it being brave? Is it, like kind of, think about the values that you have, the kind of character strengths that you really believe are like, something when you exercise them, you feel good. And then figure out ways to bring that into more of our life. Our job is one example, but another thing you can do is to infuse that more into your relationships. You mentioned people who are, again, if you're in a terrible abusive relationship, get out of that. That's not great. But many of us are just in relationships that feel a little stale because we're not putting work into it. But doing this thing where you think about each other's values, one of those things that I just mentioned that you both like. Can you kind of build that up together? If you both like learning, go to like look at a new documentary or go on some museum website or go to a real museum, if the COVID thing is going down, right? If you really like doing things that are brave, take a trip to like some hiking spot that's kind of hard and like push yourself a little bit, right? We forget that we can engage our values in an active way and that can make us feel really good.
We mentioned before that having our material needs met makes us happy. And I've seen this number batted around a lot, but above, let's say, this material needs money, making more money does not necessarily make us more happy. What is the number? Because, we've all seen this study where it's like above X, your marginal happiness doesn't get any bigger. But every time I hear this quoted, the freaking number is different.
Well, I mean, that number, if you looked at a study that was done in like 1922, like that
Right,
number
yeah.
probably,
$12,000 a year is what you
yeah.
need.
And so, the one that I often like to quote was a study that was done in 2009, so a teensy bit, out of date already, but the number in that famous paper was around $75,000. The idea is that, past $75,000, you're not going to get happier. And that study was striking. Again, we could adjust and for inflation, we could figure out what the number is, but what's striking is in the 2009 data, it wasn't just that you don't get happier with more money. Like you could look at people with quadruple that salary and they have no difference in their life satisfaction, right? And that is just not what we think. Most of the people listening right now, if I said, I'm going to like quadruple or quintuple your salary, you'd be like stoked. You'd be like, my
Hmm.
life will be demonstrably better. I'll be way satisfied with my life. And that simply is not what's pulled out of the data. And so you might get a little happier, you might be able to buy a few
Hmm.
more things, but like it's not going to have as much of an impact on your happiness as say if you boosted your social connection or if you job crafted at work or honestly if you just gave yourself a little bit more free time. So it's not so much that money has zero effect on happiness. It's like the effect on happiness isn't that big and the amount of work you have to put into it, if you put that amount of work into pretty much any of these other happiness hacks, they'd work so much better.
By the way, that's $95,000 in today's money, $75,000 in 2009. So for example, if you're making $40,000 a year, you get a bump to 70K, you feel less stress, maybe that makes you more happy. So we strive for those increments, which makes sense, right? But unfortunately, and you've mentioned this in your work, what that teaches us is, hey, every time I get an incremental salary bump, I'm incrementally happier. But then if it tops off at $95,000 in today's money, when I was a lawyer on Wall Street, I think I started off at 160 grand a year, and you get a bonus. Nobody was happy with that after the first. Like if you didn't get a raise and then your bonus wasn't out, you would sit there. I know investment bankers back when I worked there that would be making like, I don't know, $400,000 a year, and they were so pissed off that somebody else got a bonus that was bigger, or that their bonus wasn't as big as they expected because the 2008. I mean, people were just in pieces about this. So the problem is people keep chasing cash well after there's not really any marginal gain in happiness. Like a drug addict who's like, wait a minute, the first time I tried this, it was awesome. Let me take more.
That's exactly right. And one of my favorite surveys that looked at this was looking at, because we could ask ourselves like what is an annual salary that after that annual salary amount you wouldn't need anymore, right? You could all guess like, if I got that amount, I'd just be good, right? And so they do this with people at different income levels. So they bring people in at the time during the survey, they brought people in earning $30,000 a year, and they say, what would be your amount? The people say, well, not 30,000, but if I got $50,000 a year, I would never need a penny more. But then the same survey looked at people who are earning $100,000 a year, and they said, are you good? And in theory, based on what the other people said, these people should be like, yeah, I'm great. It's piling up in my kitchen. I don't need it, right? But these folks who are earning $100,000 say they need $250,000 a year to be happy. And so, if you
That
do
checks out.
if you do the math on this, you get two things. One is like you never get to the goal, but what's worth the goal gets further away as you get more money. So you're only $20,000 off if you're at 30K, but now you're $150,000 off if you're earning 100K. Like it doesn't make sense, but again, our brains can't be objective, right? When you're earning $100,000 a year, you're hanging out with people who are earning more. All your investment bankers you were talking about, like they just know people who are getting more than them, and that makes them feel bad. But unless you're literally Jeff Bezos listening to this right now, probably somebody who's earning more than you. Like
Yeah,
we're
right.
all silver medalists in the salary game, except for one person on this planet. And so yeah, so we shouldn't let others people's salary affect us. We should be objectively happy with what we have, but we're kind of not.
Right. This goes back to reference points, right? Happiness can be relative. It's better to be, this is interesting. It's better to be richer than your poor neighbors versus, well, or at least than your neighbors in general, versus being rich with other rich people. And that completely checks out. Like the most miserable people I know are not people that work two jobs and are struggling to feed their kids. I mean, those people are stressed out, but the most absolutely like negative self-talk, can't even be around them type of people are people that have like $14 million instead of 50. They are insufferable and annoying and just terrible. Like you can't even be in the room with them because everything is about how somebody else's plane is bigger or something. It's really gross.
Yeah, for on the Happiness Lab podcast, for my episode on this, I interviewed this guy, Clay Cockrell, who is amazing. So he's a wealth psychologist, a mental health professional that only works with the 0.0001%, which is like, bracketed like such a good gig. Like, why didn't I?
Yeah,
Anyway, but
right.
but
Should have thought of that.
but first shock, he has clients, right? All our theories are like, if we had that much money, we'd be fine. We wouldn't need to be paying somebody to like, counsel us. But what's shocking, if you look at the things that they're upset about, it is like this stuff that you're like, really, like I can't figure out a place to park my yacht. Like I'm having marital
It's too
problems
big. There's
'cause
no
we're
port
fighting the yacht.
nearby. Yeah.
Or like, I'm only in the 100 millions. I can't get to a billion. If only I could get to be a billionaire, right? Instead of 900 million, and so they're not happy, right? Like they're struggling with this stuff. And so we assume if we got there, that wouldn't be us. But the same kind of stuff creeps in, and so it affects our
Yeah.
happiness more than we think.
No, I can speak to that a little bit because I remember when I was younger thinking I just need to make the equivalent of 100 grand a year. And I thought that when I worked for like $5.25 at a movie theater, and then I got my job on Wall Street and I was like 160,000. This is great. And then 2 years later, I was like, so when do we get a raise and how much is it? And like, what is our bonus check going to be? And then I started my own business and it was like, I just want to get back to a regular level of income. It doesn't have to be what I earned on Wall Street. And then I got past the Wall Street thing or got to the Wall Street thing. And I was like, well, okay, now I want this. And then every time I hit the goal, it's like, it would be great if I had a slightly rounder number or another comma in there would be good. Or like, what if we got from this to that, then do fancy math, inflation calculator, investment, compound interest, this, that, and the other thing. We could buy this house or like, but I don't even care about the home or the money. It doesn't affect me. It's almost like an idle. It's like my brain is almost doing it, but my wife and I routinely talk about how much we actually spend, which is barely any of our, like we live well below our means. So it's not, I need a Ferrari. It's just like my brain torturing itself with math.
Yeah. And I think, this is something is that like, we have these theories about what's going to make us happy. And one of the things we like to do is to like work towards things that are measurable, right? If I ask like, how grateful are you today, this year versus last year? Hard to know, but what's your annual salary this year versus last year? So easy for us to know that number, right? And so that means we end up prioritizing the things we can measure over the things that probably matter more, like how socially connected are you, how grateful are you, how present are you, how much do you feel like you're have a lot of free time and you're really wealthy in terms of time. Those are the things that probably matter more, but it's not like we have a score in our bank account that's telling us those things, so it's not as easy for us to think about maximizing them or put work towards maximizing them because we don't as easily notice the rewards as we do when we're like fight for a raise and get it, even though it doesn't have an effect on our happiness.
The comparison thing seems like it could just get so toxic though, right? We'd rather be superior to others even if we sacrifice money or looks, right? So it really is all about those reference points. But to your point, we set the target upward because we're productive achievers, like you mentioned, right? So we set them very high, right? I'm not thinking about friends of mine that have some money. I'm thinking about like my richest friend, right? Who's out just obviously an outlier. Okay. And then, or my like best looking friend who is literally a European fashion model. Okay. So what are you like? Are you kidding me? Why would you do that to yourself? And it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So it's always an extreme alternative, which never wins, right? Because if you think about this from like a almost like a philosophical angle, who's more socially active, you or like air quotes other people, or who's richer, you or someone else, like anyone? The answer is always not you in every category, generally.
And it's amazing how our brains will like seek out exactly the reference point that makes us feel worst about ourselves.
Sure.
I was doing some consulting with the like a cannot be named NBA team, and I was talking about these things, and I was like putting up like, okay, who are your reference points for this? Like, who's your reference points for free throw? And they all scream out like Steph Curry. Who's your reference points for height? It was like Taco Fail. Like, who's your reference points for having awesome cars? Like LeBron James. It was like I'm like, well, why isn't just why don't you pick just like one awesome NBA player and feel bad? No, you specifically pick the one that's gonna make you feel the worst. Like no one thinks of height when they're thinking of Steph Curry, and they're like, well, I'm taller than Steph. Like, I don't care, right? They're specifically picking the people that make them feel worse. And that's like, one case of professional athletes who are all pretty good at all those things that I've just talked about. But we all just kind of do this. We pick the person that's like most attractive if we're thinking about our attractiveness. We pick the person with the most money if we're thinking about money. And if we think about like, oh, I wish I had a good relationship, we just like scroll through and find someone we think is like in a happy marriage. Like, we constantly pick the thing that makes us feel the worst, and we're surrounded by structures that make that even harder, right? It was one thing back in the day when we probably had brains that did this when we were hunter gatherers, walking around the plains and we could see like 18 other people. Now we just have the internet that's filled with people curating what these things feel like to them, and curating how awesome their lives are, and that just can make us feel so crappy to see that stuff.
This sort of manufactured bullshit, right? The alternatives are always on social media. I I neglect my Instagram generally. I only post there like twice a year, but I always answer my DMs. And I'll get a DM from somebody with like the blue check mark, and I'll go, oh, I wonder what this person does. And they're a war photographer, so they've got all these cool and I'm like, your life is so exciting. Where are you right now? Oh, I'm outside Syria, and I'm downloading a few episodes of your show because I finally have internet. I'm like, ah, it's so cool. And then somebody else is like, my favorite hotel in the Swiss Alps is this one. Here's a bunch of photos of me in an awesome dress with my husband just like drinking handcrafted cocktails on a balcony. And I'm like, I'm in my kitchen and I feel kind of fat because I ate Fritos. Like, like that's where I'm at. So the alternatives are just even worse now because of social media. Like anytime you're feeling good about yourself, don't worry, crack open Instagram and look at how shit your life actually is compared to somebody else. But if you talk to these people, the war photographer is like, I need to figure out how I'm going to make money because I made like $300 this month from one photo, and like I'm spending way more just to exist in this environment. My hotel costs more than that because there's only one in the whole country that's open, has electricity. And then the influencer person in the amazing hotel is like, yeah, I kind of have to shill Listerine and mattresses like nonstop because I stay at these places for free, but I don't have any money. How am I going to retire? This is my business and I'm just getting started. And look how many followers this other person has. So we're all on the treadmill, but we're all pretending like we're not on the treadmill.
Yeah, and this is one of my favorite studies that I tell my students about, just makes this point so well, right? So they bring college students in and they ask, how often do these good and bad events happen to you? So good events, you got a better grade than you expected, or someone you liked asked you out, went to a cool party. Or these bad events, right? Got a crappy grade, felt lonely, felt really homesick, like really embarrassed, like some embarrassing thing happens, whatever. So you tick off how often it happens to you. And then you say, how often do these events happen to the average college student? So you get this prediction, how often it happens to an individual person and how often they predict. But of course, if you ask every individual person, you can get the accurate percentage of how often it's happening in general. And so you look at these, and what you find is that people's predictions are completely wrong. So for the positive events, people think these are happening all the time. Everybody's going to a cool party. Everybody's getting grades better than they expect. Everybody's getting asked out. And the fact is, like, that's not really happening to that many people. But that effect of being wrong is even stronger in the negative direction. You predict 0 people are feeling homesick like I am, 0 people are feeling fat like I am, 0 people got worse grades. And the effects are huge. Like people are off by like 30 percentage points of what they think. And so this is kind of bad, right? It means not just that we're comparing ourselves against other people, but we're creating this imaginary awesome person who has
Right.
only good things happen and no negative things. Um, there's some quote I'm now forgetting, I'm like bad at
I'll
names, so I'm
tell you right
forgetting.
now I know exactly where you're going. We compare our blooper reel to everybody else's highlight reel. Is that it?
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And it'd be one thing if we were comparing ourselves against real people and feeling bad, but we always feel worse because we imagine people to be richer and more beautiful than they really are. And so,
Right.
but one thing that this study also showed is that if you ask people, hey, all those good things and bad things that you just talked about, do you try to boost them on social media? Really, do you try to make the good things seem better and make the bad things seem less true? And people say, yeah, I definitely try to hide the bad things. I definitely try to show off the good things. And that's bad. We're like all participating in this collective culture of making our own reference point seem better in a way that makes other people around us feel crappy.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame, but I also totally understand it because even I've talked about this before. Even some of the people that you see on social media who say like, "No, I'm gonna post all the real stuff." Even that stuff is, I mean, it's fake, right? Like they're doing a video and they're a cute couple and they accidentally cut each other off. No, you go. No, you go. They planned that shit. I know it because you know someone who works for them or whatever, and they're like, "Yeah, that's in the script." Like it's totally the whole thing is BS. Or like, "Oh, we fought today, but we fought about who loves each other more." And it's like, shut up. Like the whole thing is nonsense. But yeah, we're all doing this to one another. That's one of the reasons I opted out of social media because I was just like, you know what? This is just making other people feel FOMO. And I hate when I feel that. So why am I going to do that to other people? What am I trying to do? It's a manipulation tactic. And I'm like, do I need to do that in my life? I don't really want to do that. I don't like it when other people do it to me. So I just stopped. I post now when like I have a real big life event, but it's just a normal life event. Like I had a birthday, not like, oh, I'm on a yacht. I just don't share that stuff. No one cares, first of all, and it never makes anyone feel good. It only makes other people feel bad. So I kind of encourage people to just, stop looking at Instagram unless they're looking at meme accounts. Those are funny.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's worth noticing that, what you're taking in kind of matters. One of the kind of tips I give my students is I tell them to hack their feeds, right? A hacker, if there's somebody who's making you feel bad about yourself, like get rid of that. Or maybe kind of fill in the stuff that's like not as good, right? Again, we will feel bad about our income if we're comparing ourselves against rich influencers. But if you put in your feed that, like, hey, there are people starving right now in all these countries, and X number of people lost their job in the middle of COVID, and you're like, oh, okay, like that's good. If you're constantly in an Instagram feed that's making you feel bad about your bodies, like put in some realistic bodies into that feed, right? In some ways, we forget that we can control and curate that. It might not be as fun to look at the like not rich influencers all the time, but you have to recognize what that's doing to your psychology and recognize that you can kind of control your own reference points. You get some control over that. Once you see it, you can't control it. You might not think it's influencing you, but it is. If it gets in there, if it gets past your eyes, it's going to influence you in a negative way. But you have some control over what you choose to look at.
Now, what are some favorite daily rituals, habits besides feed hacking that you found increase happiness and aren't maybe like a huge time sucker commitment?
Yeah, one of my favorite ones, which sounds so cheesy. I mean, it's worth saying at the outset, like none of these happiness tips had a great like marketing team. Like they all sound like kind of hippy dippy, like platitudey, grandmothery stuff. But every single one I'm going to tell you about is backed by like some of the latest science. And so one of my favorite ones, again, sounds cheesy but works, is this idea of gratitude, like
Oh
counting
yeah,
your
we've
blessings. Like
sure.
so cheesy, right? But it totally works. Turns out that the simple act of scribbling down 3 to 5 things you're grateful for at the end of the day can significantly improve your well being in as little as 2 weeks. But it doesn't just do that, it allows you to be kind of happy in your life. Gratitude is a sort of pro social emotion. And so it causes you to want to like give back. So grateful people are more likely to do nice stuff for other people. It like makes you a better person, but it also makes you a more productive person because one of the people gratitude makes you want to give back to is your future self. So it turns out grateful people are more likely to eat healthier. They're more likely to save more for retirement easily. They're more likely to exercise. It makes it easier to do the thing that, like, future you would benefit from, but it kind of sucks right now to do. Grateful people do that easily, right? And so, like, it's kind of a win-win. It like feels awesome, and it's going to cause you to feel more productive to get to your goal, right? I mean, it sounds like gratitude, but like, no,
Hmm.
it's like, it's like productivity hacks, it's like really what
Right.
it is, right?
I,
Um,
I'm down with that one. I thought it was cheesy for years, never did it, didn't even allow people to mention it on the show because I thought it was so stupid. And then a friend of mine, we shared a room on a hiking trip, and he was like, "All right, every day me and my wife do the three amazing things about today." And I was like, "Ugh, I don't have anything." He's like, "No, the idea is you have to stretch and find it." And I was like, "Well, I got a haircut this morning." He's like, "Great." I was like, "Well, we're flying to the Himalayas tomorrow to go hiking." He's like, "Yes, that's an obvious one. What else?" And so you start thinking about all these things that you really just weren't even thinking about because you never, like, why would you bother, right? That's tomorrow. This is a thing I did today earlier. I'm not thinking about it anymore. So it forces you to then think about all these things. We call it three amazing things. And it can be like, oh, our kid was so cute. He was jumping on the couch and he said, like, daddy's coming or something like that. And he's never said that before. And then, my wife will go, oh, he said another thing that was really funny today too. And it turns into this conversation that's not about like, hey, did you take out the garbage? Oh, we're out of milk. Why didn't you do that thing I told you to do the other day that you forgot twice in a row, right? It just changes the whole vibe and it makes a really interesting and fun conversation. So I can see that that actually is a real thing that works and not just a bunch of BS because it does sound like influencer Instagram-y BS, candidly.
I mean, yeah, I think it's, I agree that it sounds this way, but I mean, the studies that are on it are just like really powerful. And they're people who tend to just be more grateful, have these benefits, but then you just force people to be more grateful. Like you force yourself to pay attention to these things and it helps. If gratitude sounds too cheesy, and another one that I've heard, which can be also quite powerful, is just basically what you're doing is you're training your brain towards the positive. Our brains naturally have this sort of negativity bias where we notice all the tigers in the world that are going to come jump out and get us. Like that's what evolutionarily made sense, is to notice the risks and the bad stuff and whatever. But that means that we're missing out naturally on attending to a lot of the things that feel good. And so if gratitude feels too cheesy, you can try a different technique that we were talking about in our upcoming season of the podcast, which is to pay attention to delights. I interview this author, Ross Gay, who has this book called The Book of Delights. And he decided that every day for a whole year, he'd write a new essay on something that delighted him. So you had to find these delights every single day. And they're kind of funny. They're things like, lilacs are a delight. And he has one that's like trust on planes. Like, why don't people steal people's stuff on trains? Like, that's kind of a delight, like the sort of odd high fives that strangers give you sometimes, El DeBarge, like the band, like every day he just comes up with something. And what he talks about is that, throughout the course of this thing, he just now is training his brain to notice this stuff.
Mm.
And then he's sharing it with people, right? So now people know he's doing this, so they tell him their delights. And that's kind of delightful when you hear like funny and, good things that are happening to other people. And then you get these kind of meta delights where you notice like, these series of things make other people delighted, and so it was just a wonderful exercise for him. So that for some people feels better than gratitude, which feels cheesy, but just like noticing things that are like awesome, like your own personal awesome list, can be quite powerful. So for the podcast, I've been doing this. I've been noticing things, and like, some of my recent things this week. That earlier this week, I had gone to the beach, just like a local beach, and there was this lady there who had a cat on a leash. Like she brought her cat like to the beach. And that was just kind of like delight. Another one was I was walking through this, we have this park in New Haven. It's not like the nicest park. Like it's not the kind of place that people kind of tend to hang out. But there was this guy there who had like this big suitcase and backpack. And he was sitting there with this huge science fiction book, like right on the last few pages. And I knew what had happened, which is like he'd probably been like traveling, maybe he was on a train or maybe he was like at a coffee shop that was closing or something, and he hadn't finished the book, and he so wanted to finish the book that he just like plopped down in the seat to like read it. And I was like, oh, it's a like delight,
Hmm.
coffee
Yeah.
delight. So it's so silly, but it just trains your brain. Like now you're not thinking about like, oh, taxes, like, oh, how long for the pandemic, oh, like our time is finite, our attention is finite, and if we can train it on stuff that's going to make us feel good, then that's going to make us feel good, but it's going to give us the resilience and the bandwidth to get through the crap of life.
I think that's amazing. It's a good place to leave it because we do have some practical exercises and stuff like that from your show. And of course, we'll link to some of this in the show notes and in the worksheet. So I know we're just scratching the surface here. Laurie, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.